On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, the sun rose over France to reveal a scene of coordinated terror that would echo through history for 7 centuries. Across the entire kingdom, from Paris to Marseille, from dawn's first light, the king's soldiers moved simultaneously. They broke down the doors of Templar commanderies, monasteries, and chapter houses. They dragged men from their beds, knights who had fought in the Holy Land, bankers who had financed kings, priests who had taken vows of poverty were shackled in chains. Over 5,000 men were arrested in a single day. It was a military operation of stunning precision. Every Templar property in France was seized. Every vault was opened. Every ledger was confiscated. The king's men were looking for gold, for silver, for the legendary treasure of the Knights Templar. But what they found was far more valuable and far more dangerous. They found records, loan agreements, debt contracts, lists of assets held in trust. And at the top of those lists, written in careful script, was the name of the king himself. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, owed the Templars a fortune. He had borrowed millions to fight his wars. He had mortgaged his kingdom to fund his ambitions. And now, with his treasury empty and his creditors demanding payment, he had decided on a solution that would define his reign and haunt history. He would not pay his debts. He would destroy his creditors. He would accuse the most powerful banking institution in Christendom of heresy, torture them until they confessed to crimes they did not commit, and then burn them alive. This is the story of the first great banking collapse, but it was not a collapse caused by bad loans or market failure. It was a collapse caused by murder. It is the story of how a king, drowning in debt, weaponized the Inquisition to commit the greatest financial crime of the Middle Ages. It is the story of how the Knights Templar, the warrior monks who invented international banking, were destroyed not by Saracens in battle, but by a Christian king in a courtroom. And it is a warning that echoes across the centuries. When the debtor has an army and the creditor does not, the ledger can be erased with blood. To understand how the Templars became the richest organization in Europe, we must go back to 1119, to the dust and heat of Jerusalem. The First Crusade had succeeded. The Holy Land was in Christian hands. Pilgrims from across Europe were traveling to Jerusalem to pray at the sites where Christ had walked. But the roads were dangerous. Bandits, Saracen raiders, and desperate men preyed on the pilgrims. They were robbed, murdered, and sold into slavery. It was into this chaos that a French knight named Hugues de Payens arrived with 8 companions. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They pledged to protect the pilgrims. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. The king of Jerusalem gave them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the ruins of Solomon's temple. The Pope gave them his blessing, and the aristocracy of Europe, moved by their piety and their mission, began to give them donations. Land, gold, castles. The donations poured in. Within a generation, the Templars were no longer poor. They owned vast estates across Europe. They had fortresses in every kingdom. But their real power came not from their swords, but from their innovation. They invented a system that would change the world. They invented international banking. Here's how it worked. A pilgrim in Paris wanted to travel to Jerusalem. The journey would take months. Carrying gold or silver was suicide. Bandits would kill you for a single coin. But the Templars offered a solution. You could deposit your money at a Templar house in Paris. They would give you a coded letter of credit. You would travel to Jerusalem unarmed and penniless. When you arrived, you would present the letter to the Templar commandery in Jerusalem, and they would give you your money, minus a small fee. It was genius. It was safe, and it made the Templars indispensable. But it was more than just a banking service. The Templars became the treasurers of kings. They held the crown jewels of France in trust. They managed the finances of kingdoms. They financed wars. If a king needed money to raise an army, he borrowed from the Templars. If a merchant needed capital to fund a trading voyage, he borrowed from the Templars. The Templars did not charge interest because the church forbade usury, but they charged fees, administrative fees, protection fees, service fees. The profits were enormous. By the late 13th century, the Templars were the most powerful financial institution in the Western world. They owned over 9,000 properties. They had their own fleet of ships. They had their own laws. They answered only to the Pope. They were a state within a state, and they were untouchable until they weren't. In 1285, Philip IV became King of France. He was 17 years old, tall, handsome, and cold. He was called Philip the Fair, not because he was just, but because of his blonde hair and pale features. Philip had a problem. His father had left him a kingdom drowning in debt. France had been at war with England, with Aragon, with Flanders. The wars had been expensive and largely unsuccessful. The treasury was empty. The nobility was restless. The merchants were demanding stability. Philip needed money, desperately. He tried everything. He debased the currency, melting down coins and reminting them with less silver. This triggered inflation and riots. He taxed the church, which brought him into conflict with the Pope. He expelled the Jews from France and confiscated their property. This gave him a temporary windfall, but it was not enough. The debt kept growing, and the biggest creditor was the Knights Templar. Philip owed them millions of livres. The Templars held the mortgage on the kingdom. They managed the royal treasury. They knew every secret of the French crown, and Philip hated them for it. He hated that they were richer than he was. He hated that they were more powerful than he was. He hated that they could say no to him, so he began to plot. If he could not pay his debts, he would erase them. But how do you destroy the most powerful organization in Christendom? You accuse them of crimes so terrible that no one will defend them. Philip had an ally in his scheme, Pope Clement V. Clement was not a strong man. He was not a holy man. He was a French aristocrat who owed his position to Philip. In 1305, Philip had maneuvered to get Clement elected pope. In return, Clement moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, a city on the French border, where Philip could control him. Clement was Philip's puppet. Together, they began to spread rumors, whispers in the courts and the monasteries. The Templars, they said, were not holy warriors. They were heretics, devil worshippers, sodomites. It was said that during their secret initiation ceremonies, new members were forced to deny Christ, to spit on the cross, and to kiss the Grand Master on the mouth, the navel, and the base of the spine. It was said that they worshipped a demonic idol called Baphomet. It was said that they practiced sorcery and black magic. None of it was true, but in the 14th century, the accusation of heresy was enough. Philip demanded that the Pope launch an investigation. Clement hesitated. The Templars were powerful. They had protected the church for 2 centuries, but Philip threatened him. He reminded Clement who had made him pope. He reminded him where the papacy now resided. Clement folded. On September 14, 1307, Philip sent out secret sealed orders to his officials across France. The orders were not to be opened until October 12th. When they were opened, they contained detailed instructions. Arrest every Templar in France, seize every property, take every document, and do it all at the same time, so that none can escape. On October 13th, 1307, the trap was sprung. The Templars, who had no reason to suspect betrayal, were caught completely off guard. The Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was in Paris. He had been a guest of honor at the funeral of the king's sister-in-law just days earlier. He had walked beside the king in the procession. Now, he was dragged from his bed and thrown into a dungeon. Along with him, 138 Templars in Paris were arrested. Across France, thousands more. The charges were read: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, sodomy. The Templars denied everything. They called the charges lies. They demanded to be tried by the Pope, as was their right. But Philip did not care about rights. He had a different plan: torture. Philip turned the prisoners over to the Inquisition. The Inquisition was an ecclesiastical court designed to root out heresy. Its methods were brutal. The Templars were stretched on the rack. Their bones were broken. Their feet were burned. They were starved. They were kept in darkness. They were told that if they confessed, the pain would stop. And one by one, they broke. Men who had fought Saracens without flinching screamed in the torture chambers of Paris. They confessed to whatever their torturers wanted. Yes, they had denied Christ. Yes, they had worshipped idols. Yes, they had committed unnatural acts. The confessions were written down. They were signed. And then they were used as evidence. But some refused to break. Some died under torture rather than confess to lies. And some, after being tortured into confession, recanted when the pain stopped. They stood before the Inquisition and said, "I confessed because you tortured me. I lied to make it stop. We are innocent." This created a problem for Philip. Under church law, if a heretic confessed and then recanted, the punishment was death, not by the church, which could not shed blood, but by the secular authorities. The heretic would be handed over to the king to be burned. But if the Templars recanted, it proved that the confessions were coerced. It proved that the charges were false. Philip needed to silence the recantations. On May 12, 1310, in a field outside Paris, 54 Templars who had recanted their confessions were tied to stakes. Wood was piled around them. The fires were lit. They burned alive. The message was clear. Confess, and you might live. Recant, and you will burn. After that, the recantations stopped. The trials dragged on for years. The Pope, under pressure from Philip, officially dissolved the order in 1312. Templar properties across Europe were seized. Most of the assets were supposed to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, a rival military order. But in France, Philip kept everything. The lands, the castles, the gold. He looted the Templars and used their wealth to pay off his debts. To other creditors. Not to the Templars themselves, of course. They were dead or imprisoned. But there was one man who would not be silenced. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, had been in prison for 7 years. He had been tortured. He had confessed, but he had not been executed. Philip wanted to keep him alive, to parade him as proof of the Templars' guilt. On March 18, 1314, de Molay was brought out onto a scaffold in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. A crowd gathered. Cardinals and bishops sat in judgment. De Molay was old now, broken by torture, a shadow of the knight he had once been. He was told to publicly confess his sins one final time. The plan was for him to confess, to be sentenced to life imprisonment, and to disappear into a dungeon forever. But Jacques de Molay did something unexpected. He stood tall, he looked at the crowd, and he spoke. "I confess," he said, "that I am guilty of the greatest sin. I lied. I confess to crimes that the order never committed. I slandered the name of the Templars to save myself from torture, but I will not die a liar. The Templars are innocent. We are guilty of nothing but loyalty to Christ and to the Church, and those who have destroyed us will answer to God." The crowd gasped. The bishops were stunned. Philip, watching from the royal palace, was enraged. De Molay had recanted, and under the law, the punishment for a relapsed heretic was death. That same day, as the sun set over Paris, Jacques de Molay and his fellow Templar, Geoffroy de Charnay, were taken to a small island in the Seine River. A platform was built. Stakes were driven into the ground. The two men were tied to the stakes. The wood was lit. As the flames rose, de Molay spoke again. He raised his voice so that all could hear. "God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon, a calamity will come to those who have condemned us to death without cause. God will avenge our death. I call upon you, Pope Clement, to meet me before God's tribunal within 40 days, and you, King Philip, within a year." It was a curse, a dying man's final words, and then the flames consumed him. The crowd stood in silence. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered that it was the voice of a saint. But Philip dismissed it as the ravings of a heretic. He returned to his palace. The Templar threat was over. He was safe, or so he thought. 40 days later, Pope Clement V died. He had been ill, but the timing was eerie. He died on April 20th, 1314, exactly 33 days after de Molay's execution. Some said it was a coincidence. Others said it was the curse. Then, in November 1314, King Philip IV went hunting. He was 46 years old, in the prime of life. During the hunt, he suffered a stroke. He collapsed from his horse. He was carried back to the palace. He died on November 29th, 1314, 8 months after de Molay's execution. Within a year, as de Molay had predicted. The curse was fulfilled. But the story does not end with the deaths of Clement and Philip. The real mystery is what happened to the Templar treasure. When Philip's men raided the Templar headquarters in Paris, they found almost nothing. The vaults were empty, the gold was gone. Where did it go? Some say that the Templars were warned in advance. Some say that a group of Templar knights escaped on the night of October 12th, loading their treasure onto ships and sailing away. Some say they went to Scotland, which was at war with England and did not recognize the Pope's authority. The Templars, it is said, were welcomed there and went underground, forming secret societies that would later become the Freemasons. Others say the treasure was taken to Switzerland, where it became the foundation of Swiss banking, a system of secrecy and neutrality that echoes the Templar model. Still others say the treasure was hidden, buried in locations known only to a few, waiting to be discovered. The Oak Island Money Pit, Rennes-le-Château in France, Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. The legends multiplied, and with them, the conspiracy theories. The Templars became ghosts, secret masters pulling the strings of history, the Illuminati, the architects of the New World Order. It is nonsense, of course, but it is nonsense born from a truth. The Templars were destroyed not because they were guilty, but because they were powerful. They were creditors to kings. And when the king could not pay, he simply erased the debt with fire. The fall of the Templars is the first recorded example of sovereign debt default through violence. It established a precedent that would be repeated throughout history. When a borrower is powerful enough, they do not need to repay. They simply destroy the lender. The Spanish crown did it to the Fugger banking family in the 16th century. The French revolutionaries did it to the aristocrats in 1789. Modern governments do it with inflation, devaluing the currency to erase the real value of their debts. The methods change, but the principle remains. Debt is a claim on power, and power does not like to be claimed. The Templars learned this lesson the hard way. They believed that their wealth, their fortresses, and their papal protection made them untouchable. They believed that the rules applied to everyone, even kings. They were wrong. Philip the Fair proved that if you owe the bank 1,000 livres, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank 1,000,000 livres, you own the bank. And if the bank asks for repayment, you burn it to the ground. The Knights Templar were the first international bankers. They created a system of credit, trust, and financial networks that spanned continents. They were 2 centuries ahead of their time, but they made a fatal mistake. They lent money to a man who had the power to rewrite the rules. And on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the rules were rewritten in blood. The legacy of the Templars is not found in their treasure or their secrets. It is found in the system they built. Modern banking, international credit, letters of exchange, these all descend from the innovations of the Knights Templar. Every time you use a credit card in a foreign country, you are using a system that the Templars pioneered. Every time a government borrows money from a central bank, it is echoing the relationship between Philip and the Templars. But the lesson of their destruction is equally relevant. Financial power without political power is vulnerability. The creditor is only safe as long as the debtor chooses to honor the debt. And when the debtor is a king, an emperor, or a state, that choice is not guaranteed. The Templars were not destroyed by Saracens. They were destroyed by a client who decided that murder was cheaper than repayment. And the world has never forgotten. To this day, Friday the 13th is considered unlucky. The superstition is a ghost of that October morning in 1307 when 5,000 men were arrested for the crime of being creditors. It is a reminder whispered through the centuries that when the powerful owe you money, you are not the one in control. They are. And if they decide that your debt is inconvenient, they will not pay it. They will erase it, along with you. This is financial injustice. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.